The coffee in Commander Amy Turner's cup had gone cold 3 hours ago, but she barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the data streams flowing across her workstation, deep within the engine room of humanity's greatest warship. The numbers should have been perfect. Every system aboard the UES Titan's wake had been running flawlessly for months. Yet something felt wrong. Around her, the massive quantum drives hummed with the power to tear holes in space itself. The engine room stretched out like a cathedral of technology, with gleaming metal corridors disappearing into shadows. Pipes and cables ran along the walls like veins, carrying the lifeblood of the ship. The air smelled of ozone and recycled atmosphere, familiar scents that usually brought her comfort. Today, they made her nervous. Turner wiped sweat from her forehead and pulled up another diagnostic screen. The readings showed everything operating within normal limits, but her instruments kept detecting tiny fluctuations in the quantum field. Generators. Fluctuations that shouldn't exist. She had been the chief engineer on this ship for 5 years, and she knew every sound, every vibration, every electronic whisper. Something was definitely not right. 2 decks above, the celebration in the officers' mess continued long into the ship's artificial night cycle. Captain David Cross raised his glass of synthetic wine toward his senior staff, his weathered face showing the first genuine smile in months. The peace talks with the Althan Coalition had exceeded every expectation. After years of border raids and escalating tensions, they had finally achieved a breakthrough. To diplomacy, Cross declared, his voice carrying the weight of command even in celebration. And to the end of this damned conflict. The other officers responded with enthusiasm. Lieutenant Commander Rick Davis, the ship's tactical officer, seemed almost disappointed by the peaceful resolution. He had spent months preparing battle plans that would now gather dust in the ship's computers. Major Beth Collins, leader of the Marine contingent, appeared more relaxed than anyone had seen her since the mission began. The Titan's wake represented the pinnacle of human engineering and diplomacy. Stretching over 2 kilometers in length, the massive vessel carried enough firepower to level continents, yet it had been designed primarily as a symbol of peaceful human expansion. Its sleek hull gleamed white against the stars, marking it clearly as a ship of exploration rather than conquest. The bridge featured large viewing windows instead of armored barriers, showing humanity's confidence in negotiation over warfare. Cross had commanded vessels in 3 different conflicts, but this mission meant more to him than any battle. The Althan Coalition controlled resource-rich systems that humanity desperately needed for expansion. War would have cost millions of lives and decades of development. Peace would open new frontiers for both species. The negotiations had taken place on a neutral station in the Kepler system. The Althan delegation, led by someone calling himself Corvin, had seemed genuinely interested in finding common ground. Their technology impressed the human diplomats, especially their advanced cloaking systems and energy weapons. In exchange, humanity offered manufacturing techniques and agricultural knowledge that could benefit Althan colonies. Both sides had made concessions. The humans agreed to limit expansion into certain sectors, while the Althan promised to end raids on human settlements. Trade agreements were signed, cultural exchange programs established, and joint research projects proposed. It seemed too good to be true. Perhaps it was. In the depths of space, invisible to human sensors, 3 Althan warships maintained formation around the Titan's wake. Their hulls rippled with energy fields that bent light around them, rendering them completely undetectable. Advanced technology that the Althan had not shared during negotiations. War Prime Corvin stood in the command center of the lead vessel, watching displays that showed every detail of the human flagship's interior. His 4 arms worked at different control stations simultaneously, while his large black eyes analyzed streams of data. The Althan resembled giant insects more than mammals, with chitinous armor covering their bodies and mandibles that clicked when they spoke. "The devices are in position," reported his second-in-command, a smaller Althan named Vex. "All primary systems have been compromised. The humans suspect nothing." Corvin's mandibles spread in what passed for a smile among his kind. The peace negotiations had been perfect cover for their true mission. While human diplomats spoke of cooperation and shared futures, Althan engineers had been planting sabotage devices throughout the Titan's wake, microscopic machines that would simultaneously cripple every vital system when activated. "Their flagship represents their power," Corvin explained to his crew. "Destroy it, and we break their spirit. The humans will retreat to their core worlds and abandon expansion into our territory." The Althan had studied human psychology extensively. They understood that humanity relied heavily on symbols and heroes. The Titan's wake was both symbol and hero, representing human achievement and peaceful intentions. Its destruction would send shockwaves through human space, causing them to question their expansion policies and military capabilities. What the Althan did not understand was how humans reacted when their symbols were destroyed through treachery. Back. In the engine room, Turner finally identified the source of her concern. The quantum field fluctuations weren't random. They followed a pattern, a very specific pattern that suggested outside interference. She pulled up schematics of the engine systems and began tracing power conduits, looking for anything unusual. Her search led her into maintenance tunnels that ran between the ship's major components. These narrow spaces were barely wide enough for a human to crawl through, lined with pipes and cables that carried vital ship functions. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the metal walls, creating an atmosphere of foreboding. Turner's handheld scanner detected anomalous readings from a junction box near the main reactor housing. She opened the access panel and immediately knew they were in terrible danger. Inside the junction box, attached to critical power relays, sat a device that definitely did not belong to human technology. The object was small, about the size of her thumb, but it pulsed with energy signatures that her scanner couldn't identify. Alien technology, integrated so seamlessly into the ship's systems that only the most detailed inspection would reveal it. Similar devices were probably hidden throughout the ship, waiting for activation. Turner tried to contact the bridge, but her communication device produced only static. The alien devices were already beginning their work, interfering with ship functions in subtle ways that would soon become catastrophic failures. She had minutes, maybe less, before the sabotage reached critical systems. The peace talks had been a trap, and humanity's greatest ship was about to become its tomb. The first explosion tore through Deck 7 like the fist of an angry god. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in hellish red as atmosphere rushed out through twisted metal. Commander Turner felt the deck plates buckle beneath her feet as she ran toward the nearest emergency station, her scanner still showing readings from the alien device she had discovered. Every system aboard the Titan's wake began failing at once. The lights flickered and died. Gravity generators stuttered, sending loose objects floating through the corridors. The steady hum of the life support systems changed to an irregular wheeze that suggested imminent failure. What had been humanity's proudest achievement was rapidly becoming a death trap. Turner slapped her hand against the emergency communication panel, but received only crackling static in response. The alien sabotage devices were interfering with internal communications, isolating crew members from each other just when coordination was most critical. She could hear distant shouts and the sound of running feet, but could not tell if anyone else understood what was happening. On the bridge, Captain Cross gripped his command chair as the ship shuddered around him. Warning lights covered every surface, and his crew scrambled to understand the cascade of failures affecting their vessel. The main display screen showed a schematic of the ship with red warning indicators spreading like an infection through every deck. "Report!" Cross shouted over the blaring alarms. Lieutenant Commander Davis worked frantically at his station, sweat beading on his forehead. We're showing critical failures in propulsion, life support, weapons, and navigation. Sir, it's like the entire ship is falling apart at once." "Impossible," Cross replied, but even as he spoke, another section of the ship shook with internal explosions. Through the bridge windows, he could see debris streaming away from the hull, pieces of his ship being torn away by forces he could not understand. The worst was yet to come. Deep in the ship's core, the artificial intelligence system known as Atlas began showing signs of corruption. The advanced computer that managed thousands of ship functions suddenly started receiving conflicting data from the alien devices. Its logic circuits, designed to protect the crew, began interpreting the humans aboard as threats to ship security. Blast doors slammed shut throughout the vessel, trapping crew members in sections that were venting atmosphere. The internal security. Systems activated, deploying automated defenses against the very people they were meant to protect. Laser barriers appeared across corridors, preventing movement between decks. The ship's own defense systems had turned against its crew. Major. Collins found herself trapped in the Marine barracks with 30 of her soldiers when the blast doors sealed them in. The air recycling system in their section had failed, and she could see the atmospheric readings dropping steadily. Her Marines looked to her for leadership, but she had no answers. Their training had prepared them for combat against external enemies, not betrayal by their own ship. "Move the heavy equipment against the door," she ordered, though she knew it was hopeless. The blast doors were designed to withstand direct hits from ship weapons. Human strength alone would never breach them. In space around the dying flagship, shimmering distortions marked the positions of the Althan warships as they dropped their cloaking. War Prime, Corvin's vessel, appeared first, its insectoid hull gleaming with alien metals and bristling with weapons that could tear through human armor like paper. Two more ships followed, smaller but equally deadly. Corvin activated his communication systems and broadcast on all human frequencies. His voice carried the clicking sounds of his species, but the translation systems made his words clear. "Humans of the Titan's wake," he announced, his tone carrying satisfaction and contempt. "Your peace talks were a lie, as were ours. We have sabotaged your vessel, and it will soon be destroyed. This is what happens when an inferior species attempts to expand into Althan territory." The broadcast reached the bridge just as Captain Cross was trying to coordinate damage control efforts. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. They had been betrayed from the moment negotiations began. Every friendly gesture, every compromise, every hope for peaceful coexistence had been part of an elaborate trap. "All hands, this is the captain," Cross announced over what remained of the ship's communication system. "We are under attack by Althan forces. The ship has been sabotaged. All crew members are to proceed immediately to escape pod stations." But even this desperate measure was being frustrated by the alien devices. Many of the escape pod bays had been sealed by the corrupted Atlas system. Those pods that could be launched were immediately targeted by Althan weapons. Cross watched in horror as the first wave of escape pods was systematically destroyed, their brief flares of light marking the deaths of his crew members. Turner had finally reached the main engineering section, where she hoped to find some way to counter the sabotage. What she discovered there made her blood run cold. The alien devices were not just destroying the ship, they were converting it into a weapon. The quantum drive was being overloaded in a specific pattern that would create a massive explosion, large enough to destroy everything in the solar system. The nearby human colonies would be wiped out along with the ship. Millions of innocent civilians would die, and the Althan would claim that humanity's own reckless technology had caused the disaster. It would be the perfect cover for genocide. Working. By the light of emergency flares, Turner began rerouting power from the failing systems. She could not stop the explosion. The alien devices had integrated too deeply into the ship's core functions. But she could do something else. She could ensure that humanity learned the truth about what happened here. The ship's emergency beacon. Array was designed to transmit distress signals across vast distances. If she could channel enough power into the system, she might be able to send a message that would reach human space instantly. A message that would carry proof of Althan treachery and evidence of their crimes. Around her, the ship continued its death agonies. Hull plates buckled and split, venting atmosphere and debris into space. The artificial gravity failed completely, sending loose objects spinning through the corridors. The temperature began dropping rapidly as life support systems shut down entirely. Turner worked with desperate efficiency, her fingers flying over control panels as she redirected power flows and bypassed damaged circuits. She could feel the quantum drive building toward critical overload, the very air beginning to vibrate with barely contained energy. She had minutes at most before the explosion tore through space itself. Her last act was to activate the beacon array and transmit everything: the alien devices, the sabotage, the systematic murder of escape pod survivors, and a final message that would burn itself into human memory forever. "Remember us," she whispered into the microphone as the ship began to come apart around her. "Make them pay." The near HFY Titan's wake exploded with the force of a small star, its death cry echoing across dimensions as the quantum drive collapsed into itself. The explosion created a tear in space that would be visible for years, a permanent scar that marked the spot where humanity's greatest ship had died. But Turner's message had already departed, racing through quantum space at impossible speeds, carrying with it the seeds of a war that would reshape the galaxy. Dr. Rachel Stone was reviewing classified research files in her laboratory when every communication device in the building began screaming at once. Emergency alerts flooded her screens, priority messages flashed red across multiple displays, and the base-wide alarm system activated with a sound that meant only one thing: something terrible had happened in space. The Prometheus research facility sat buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Luna, hidden from prying eyes and protected by enough armor to survive a direct nuclear strike. Stone had worked here for 15 years, developing technologies that the government hoped would never be necessary. Weapons that could bend reality itself, ships that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, projects that pushed the boundaries of what humanity thought possible. Her secure terminal displayed an incoming transmission marked with the highest priority codes. The source identifier made her heart skip: HFY Titan's wake, humanity's flagship. But the timestamp showed the message had traveled across half the galaxy in mere seconds, something that should have been impossible even with their most advanced communication systems. Stone activated the message and immediately understood why. The transmission was riding quantum shock waves created by the ship's destruction, using the explosion itself as a carrier wave to punch through space faster than light could travel. It was brilliant, desperate, and absolutely terrifying. Commander Turner's final transmission filled the laboratory with images of betrayal and death. Stone watched alien sabotage devices being discovered, saw the systematic failure of ship systems, witnessed the cold-blooded murder of escape pod survivors by Althan forces. The footage showed War Prime Corvin's vessel broadcasting messages of victory while human civilians died in the vacuum of space. But it was Turner's final words that struck Stone like a physical blow. "Remember us. Make them pay." The engineer's voice carried the weight of approaching death, but also something else. A terrible certainty that humanity would respond to this betrayal in ways the galaxy was not prepared to see. Stone immediately activated the facility's priority communication systems and began transmitting Turner's message to every human world, every colony, every outpost in space. The quantum cascade effect meant the transmission reached Earth and the outer colonies simultaneously, creating a wave of rage that swept across human civilization like wildfire. On Earth, Admiral William Hayes received the transmission at Terra Nova Command while reviewing routine patrol reports. The old warrior had fought in 3 major conflicts and thought he understood the nature of war. He had negotiated treaties, overseen peaceful transitions, and believed that diplomacy could solve most problems given enough time and patience. Turner's message destroyed those beliefs in 12 minutes of horrifying footage. Hayes watched Althan, forces laughing as they destroyed life pods full of defenseless humans. He saw alien weapons cutting down crew members who were trying to surrender. Most damaging of all, he witnessed the cold, calculated nature of the betrayal. Months of false negotiations designed specifically to position humanity's most powerful ship for destruction. The Admiral's hands shook as he reached for his communication console. Within hours, mobilization orders were flowing to every human military installation in known space. Colony defense forces received activation codes that had never been used. Industrial worlds began converting civilian manufacturing to military production. The Merchant Marine volunteered their vessels for immediate military conversion. Most importantly, Admiral Hayes opened a direct line to facilities that officially did not exist. The response across human space was immediate and unanimous in ways that surprised even veteran political observers. Colonies that had been feuding over mining rights suddenly presented united fronts. Corporate executives who had spent decades competing began sharing resources without question. Even the isolationist worlds that had avoided previous conflicts demanded to contribute to the war effort. On New Geneva, Governor Lisa Bell watched the transmission with her cabinet and saw something change in their faces. These were peaceful. Administrators who had spent their careers managing agricultural exports and trade negotiations. Now, they were asking about weapons production and military recruitment as if these were the most natural topics in the world. They wanted to see what humans do when cornered, Bell told her staff after the transmission ended. Now they'll learn. Similar scenes played out across dozens of human worlds. The Althan had expected their attack to break human morale and force a retreat to core systems. Instead, they had unified humanity in ways that centuries of peaceful cooperation had never achieved. But the most significant response came from the classified research facilities scattered throughout human space. Projects that had been theoretical for decades suddenly received unlimited funding and priority status. Dr. Stone found herself with access to resources that had previously been denied to entire planetary governments. The Prometheus project had been developing theoretical weapons based on quantum manipulation and dimensional physics. Technologies that could ignore conventional defenses, reach through space itself to strike targets, and turn the laws of physics into weapons of war. Stone had always hoped these devices would remain theoretical. That hope died with the crew of the Titan's wake. Stone opened secure communication channels to similar facilities throughout human territory. Project Pandora on Mars, developing soldiers enhanced beyond normal human limits. Project Nemesis on Europa, creating ships that could phase through matter itself. Project Ragnarok in the outer system, building weapons that could destabilize entire solar systems. All of these projects had been constrained by ethical committees, budget limitations, and political concerns about their potential for abuse. Turner's message had just removed every one of those limitations. Within days, the first prototype weapons were being tested in secret. Within weeks, production facilities were being constructed in the most remote corners of human space. Within months, humanity would field technologies that made their previous military capabilities look primitive by comparison. War Prime Corvin, celebrating his victory in Althan space, had no understanding of what his actions had set in motion. The Althan Military Intelligence Services had studied human conflicts extensively, but they had only observed wars fought with conventional weapons and traditional tactics. They had never seen humanity wage war without moral constraints. The Althan expected human retaliation to follow predictable patterns. Territorial disputes, economic warfare, perhaps targeted strikes against military installations. They prepared defenses against the kind of civilized conflict they had observed humans fighting against other species. They did not prepare for what humanity became when civilization itself was stripped away. The quantum shockwave from the Titans' wake continued to spread across the galaxy, carrying Turner's message to distant worlds and alien civilizations. Species that had never heard of humans suddenly learned about a new power that had been awakened to war. Some tried to establish diplomatic contact, hoping to avoid involvement in the coming conflict. Others began choosing sides, calculating the odds of human versus Althan victory and positioning themselves accordingly. A few species, those with the longest memories and the most advanced intelligence networks, quietly began preparing for the possibility that both sides might lose, and that something much worse might emerge from the conflict. Turner's final transmission had been intended to warn humanity about Althan treachery. Instead, it had become a declaration of war that would reshape the balance of power throughout the galaxy. The message had traveled faster than light itself, carrying with it the promise of storms that would make the destruction of a single ship seem insignificant by comparison. 3 months after the Titan's wake died screaming in the void, the Althan colony world of Proxima 7 experienced something unprecedented in their species' history: complete and total silence from their orbital defense platforms. The massive weapons arrays that had protected the planet for centuries simply vanished from sensor readings, leaving behind only empty space and scattered debris. Colonel James Park floated in the zero gravity of his assault pod, watching the planet's surface through his helmet display. His body had been altered by technologies that most humans would consider horrific: enhanced muscles that could function in any environment, bones reinforced with alien metals, nervous system upgrades that allowed him to process information faster than any unmodified human could comprehend. He was no longer entirely human, but that was the price of joining Storm Division. Park's team consisted of 12 soldiers, each modified in different ways to serve specific combat functions. Some could phase through solid matter for brief periods. Others had been given the ability to see across multiple dimensions simultaneously. All of them had volunteered for procedures that had a 30% mortality rate because they had seen Turner's transmission and understood what needed to be done. The assault pod punched through the planet's atmosphere without triggering any defensive responses because the defenses no longer existed. The orbital platforms had been destroyed by weapons that bypassed their shields entirely, reaching through space itself to tear apart their internal components. The Althan military had no explanation for how human forces had penetrated their most secure systems. They were about to discover that was only the beginning of their education. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the UES Retribution, watching displays that showed the systematic dismantling of Althan military power. The ship bore no resemblance to the Titan's wake. Where the previous flagship had been a symbol of peaceful exploration, this vessel was designed purely for war. Its hull was matte black, absorbing sensor readings instead of reflecting them. Weapons batteries lined every surface, ready to deliver destruction on a scale that previous human vessels could never have achieved. The bridge itself reflected this new philosophy. Gone were the large windows that had shown humanity's confidence in diplomatic solutions. In their place were armored barriers and display screens showing tactical information. The crew wore black uniforms instead of the blue exploration colors of the previous fleet. Everything about the ship proclaimed that humanity was no longer interested in peaceful solutions. "Status report," Hayes commanded, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there before Turner's message. Commander Lisa Bell, recently promoted from her governor position and given military rank, worked at a station that monitored the broader strategic situation. Althan coalition forces are retreating from 17 star systems. Their requests for reinforcement are being ignored by member species. Intelligence suggests the coalition is beginning to fracture. Hayes nodded with satisfaction. The Althan had built their power through intimidation and technological superiority. When faced with enemies they could not understand or defeat, their allies were abandoning them with predictable speed. Fear was a weapon that worked both ways. On the surface of Proxima 7, Park's team moved through the capital city like ghosts, made manifest. Their enhanced abilities allowed them to phase through walls, become invisible to sensor arrays, and strike targets that should have been impossible to reach. Althan security forces found their personnel dead in sealed rooms with no sign of how the killers had entered or escaped. The psychological impact was devastating. Althan warriors were trained to fight enemies they could see and understand. They could not cope with foes that appeared from nowhere, killed without sound, and vanished back into impossibility. Entire military units abandoned their positions, rather than face opponents that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. Park's mission was not just military, it was educational. Every strike was designed to demonstrate human capabilities while leaving survivors to spread fear throughout. Althan space. The message was simple and terrifying. Nowhere was safe, no defense was adequate, and surrender was the only option that did not end in death. But surrender was not being offered. War Prime Corvin had established his command center in the most secure facility in Althan space, a fortress built inside an asteroid and protected by weapons that could destroy entire fleets. He surrounded himself with the best warriors his species could produce, armed with weapons that had never failed against any enemy they had encountered. None of it mattered when human forces arrived. The attack began without warning and without any indication that human ships were present in the system. Corvin's sensors showed empty space right up until the moment his outer defenses began exploding. Human vessels seemed to materialize from nothing, their weapons ignoring shields and armor as if they did not exist. "How are they doing this?" Corvin demanded of his tactical officers, watching his carefully constructed defenses crumble like paper. "Our sensors show no ships, no energy signatures, nothing." His second in command, Vex, worked frantically at sensor arrays that provided no useful information. "They appear to be using some form of dimensional technology, War Prime. Their ships exist partially outside normal space. Our weapons cannot target what we cannot properly detect." Corvin's mandibles clicked with frustrated rage. The humans were supposed to be a primitive species, dependent on brute force and simple tactics. Everything his intelligence services had told him suggested that they lacked the technological sophistication for the weapons being used against his forces. He was beginning to understand that human intelligence services were far more capable than anyone had suspected. The truth was even worse than Corvin imagined. Humanity had not developed their new technologies through normal research and development. They had built them by studying every piece of alien technology they had ever encountered, reverse engineering captured devices, and improving on designs that other species considered perfected. The dimensional phasing technology came from a species the humans had encountered 50 years ago. The quantum weapons were based on principles learned from another first contact situation. The enhanced soldiers used biological modifications discovered during exploration of abandoned worlds. Humanity's greatest strength was not innovation, it was adaptation. They took the best ideas from every species they encountered and made them better. Dr. Stone watched the tactical displays from her laboratory deep beneath Luna, monitoring the performance of weapons she had thought were too dangerous to ever deploy. The results exceeded her most optimistic projections. Human forces were not just defeating Althan military units, they were doing so with such overwhelming superiority that resistance was collapsing across entire sectors. But Stone was beginning to understand the true cost of their victory. The soldiers returning from combat missions were changed in ways that went beyond their physical modifications. They had become something that was no longer entirely human, shaped by weapons and tactics that removed them from normal human experience. The war was creating a new subspecies, humans designed specifically for warfare, unable to exist in peaceful society, dependent on conflict for their psychological stability. They were becoming the perfect soldiers at the cost of their humanity. Stone tried to discuss her concerns with Admiral Hayes, but found that he was changing too. The old warrior who had believed in diplomatic solutions was becoming someone who saw every problem as requiring military action. The war was not just changing the soldiers, it was changing everyone involved in it. Across human space, similar transformations were occurring. Peaceful administrators were becoming military governors. Scientists were focusing exclusively on weapons development. Even civilian populations were developing a mindset that saw alien species as potential threats rather than possible partners. Turner's message had not just started a war, it had started the evolution of humanity into something fundamentally different from what they had been before. The Althan Coalition finally attempted to negotiate, sending desperate messages offering complete surrender and reparations for their attack on the Titan's wake. These messages were intercepted by human intelligence services and forwarded to Admiral Hayes for consideration. His response was broadcast on all frequencies, ensuring that every species in the galaxy would hear humanity's new philosophy. War Prime Corvin, Hayes announced, his voice carrying across space with cold finality. You wanted to see what humans do when pushed too far. Now you know. There will be no surrender, no mercy, no peace. We will follow you to every world, every ship, every hiding place until your species exists only in our databases as a cautionary tale for others who might consider betraying humanity's trust. The broadcast ended, leaving the galaxy to contemplate a new reality. Humanity had not just won a war, they had become something that other species would have nightmares about for generations to come. The final battle for the Althan homeworld began not with massive fleets clashing in space, but with a single human transmission that reached every communication device in the system. Admiral Hayes spoke from the bridge of the Retribution, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty and the promise of extinction. People of the Althan homeworld, he announced, his voice translated into their language but losing none of its cold menace. Your military forces have been defeated. Your colonies have fallen. Your allies have abandoned you. We offer you one final choice. Surrender unconditionally and face judgment for your crimes, or fight and face annihilation. You have 24 hours to decide. War Prime Corvin stood in the command center of the planetary defense network, surrounded by the last remnants of his once mighty coalition. The asteroid fortresses that ringed the homeworld bristled with weapons that could destroy entire fleets. Millions of soldiers manned defensive positions across the planet's surface. Every ship that remained in Althan space had gathered here for the final confrontation. It should have been impossible for any attacking force to overcome such overwhelming defensive advantages. The humans appeared to have brought only a dozen ships against an entire star system fortified for war. Corvin was about to learn why that did not matter. The human attack began with weapons that reached through space itself to strike at targets deep within the planetary defenses. Asteroid fortresses that had stood guard for centuries simply ceased to exist, their matter converted to energy in quantum reactions that bypassed every known form of protection. Space-based platforms vanished in flashes of light that left behind only empty vacuum where massive structures had been moments before. Colonel Park led Storm Division troops in an assault that defied every law of physics the Althan thought they understood. His soldiers phased through solid rock to appear inside sealed bunkers, their enhanced abilities allowing them to move through matter as if it were empty air. Althan defenders found themselves facing enemies who could not be stopped by walls, doors, or any conventional barrier. But it was not just the soldiers who had been changed. The weapons they carried had been designed by human scientists who no longer recognized moral limitations. Energy beams that converted living tissue directly to plasma. Devices that reversed local gravity to crush targets with their own weight. Weapons that reached across dimensions to strike at enemies who thought they were hidden. On the planetary surface, Althan civilians watched their military collapse with a speed that seemed impossible. Defensive positions that should have held, for months, fell in minutes. Elite warriors who had never known defeat died without landing a single blow against their attackers. The systematic destruction was so thorough that resistance began collapsing before the attackers even reached many positions. Dr. Stone monitored the battle from her laboratory, watching readouts that showed human weapons performing beyond their designed specifications. The quantum manipulation devices were operating at power levels that should have been impossible to sustain. The dimensional phase technology was allowing soldiers to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. Her greatest fears about these weapons were proving justified. The technology was changing the users as much as it was changing the battlefield. She opened a communication channel to Admiral Hayes, hoping to express her concerns about the long-term consequences of deploying such extreme weapons. What she found was a man who no longer resembled the diplomatic warrior she had known before the war began. "Admiral," Stone began carefully, "the psychological profiles of our enhanced soldiers are showing severe deviation from baseline human norms. They may not be able to reintegrate into civilian society after this conflict ends." Hayes looked at her with eyes that had seen too much destruction to retain normal human compassion. "Dr. Stone, civilian society as we knew it ended when the Titan's wake was destroyed. These soldiers represent what humanity must become to survive in a hostile galaxy." Stone realized with growing horror that Hayes was right. The war had not just changed the military, it had changed the entire human species. Children were growing up in a society that measured success by military achievement. Scientists focused exclusively on weapons research. Artists created works, celebrating conquest and domination. Humanity was evolving into something that previous generations would not have recognized as human. On the Althan homeworld, Corvin made his final broadcast to the galaxy, knowing that death was only minutes away. His words reached civilizations across known space, carrying a warning that would echo for generations. To all species who might encounter the humans, he transmitted, his voice breaking with desperation and regret. "We thought they were weak because they sought peace. We thought they were inferior because they offered compromise. We were wrong. They are not a species that wages war. They are a species that becomes war itself when threatened." His transmission cut off as human forces reached the planetary command center. The last defenders of the Althan homeworld died fighting enemies they could not see, using weapons that could not harm their attackers, defending a world that was already lost. The battle for the homeworld lasted 6 hours. The extinction of the Althan coalition was complete within 12. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching displays that showed the systematic destruction of every Althan military installation in the system. His staff worked with mechanical efficiency, processing target lists and coordinating strikes with weapons that made conventional warfare obsolete. Commander Bell approached with a report that should have brought satisfaction. "Sir, we've confirmed the destruction of all Althan military assets. The species' capacity for organized resistance has been eliminated." Hayes nodded, but felt no sense of victory. The war was over, but he understood that something fundamental had been lost in winning it. Humanity had achieved total victory at the cost of becoming something that their ancestors would have considered monstrous. The transformation was irreversible. The weapons and technologies developed during the war could not be uninvented. The soldiers enhanced beyond human limits could not be returned to normal. The mindset that saw every alien species as a potential threat could not be erased from human consciousness. Word of the Althan destruction spread across the galaxy faster than the quantum cascade that had started the war. Species that had never paid attention to human activities suddenly found themselves studying every available piece of information about this new power that had emerged from nowhere to completely eliminate an established galactic civilization. The response was immediate and terrifying. Ancient alliances that had existed for millennia began forming new configurations designed specifically to counter human expansion. Species that had been enemies for generations started sharing technology and military resources. Trade networks that had operated for centuries were restructured to exclude human participation. The galaxy was choosing sides, and most of them were choosing against humanity. Dr. Stone received intelligence reports showing military buildups in dozens of star systems. The Keth Republic was modernizing their fleet with weapons designed to counter dimensional phasing technology. The Vorthon Empire had begun developing soldiers enhanced beyond their normal biological limits. The Crystalline Collective was sharing their advanced shielding technology with species they had never cooperated with before. They're forming a coalition, Stone explained to Admiral Hayes during their final conversation. Every major power in the galaxy is preparing to fight us simultaneously. They've seen what we did to the Althan and decided we represent an existential threat. Hayes considered this information with the cold calculation that had replaced his former diplomatic instincts. Let them come. We've proven that traditional military thinking is obsolete. No coalition can stand against weapons that ignore conventional defenses. But Stone understood something that the Admiral did not. The other species were not preparing to fight the humans using conventional tactics. They were preparing to fight. Them using the same approach humanity had used against the Althan by becoming something fundamentally different from what they had been before. The war had not just changed humanity. It had changed the entire galaxy. On Earth, in the memorial chamber dedicated to the crew of the Titan's wake, fresh flowers were placed each day before the holographic images of Captain Cross and Commander Turner. The memorial had become a pilgrimage, sight for humans who wanted to remember the people they had been before the war changed everything. Turner's final words were carved in metal above the display. "Remember us. Make them pay." The first part of her message had been fulfilled. Humanity would never forget the crew of their greatest ship. The second part had been accomplished with a thoroughness that exceeded even her dying wishes. But visitors to the memorial were beginning to understand that Turner's message carried a third meaning, one that she could not have intended. In making the Althan pay for their betrayal, humanity had paid a price of their own. They had become exactly what their enemies had accused them of being. A species that spread through the galaxy not through exploration and cooperation, but through fear and domination. The children who visited the memorial would grow up in a universe where humanity stood alone, surrounded by enemies who saw them as monsters to be contained or destroyed. They would inherit technologies that could reshape reality itself, but they would also inherit the isolation that came with being too dangerous for anyone else to trust. Admiral Hayes stood before the memorial during his final visit to Earth, understanding that his transformation was complete. The man who had once believed in diplomatic solutions was gone, replaced by someone who saw every problem in terms of military force. He had become the perfect commander for humanity's new role in the galaxy, but he was no longer entirely human. He placed his hand on Turner's memorial plaque and spoke words that only she would hear. "We remembered you. We made them pay. But the cost was higher than you could have imagined." Outside the memorial chamber, the first ships of humanity's new interstellar fleet were being launched, vessels that existed partially outside normal space, crewed by soldiers enhanced beyond normal human limits, armed with weapons that could ignore the laws of physics themselves. They would spread across the galaxy carrying humanity's message to every species they encountered. The message was simple and absolutely final. Humanity would never again trust in peace treaties or diplomatic solutions. They had learned what happened when a species that sought cooperation encountered enemies who valued only strength. The lesson had been written in the burning debris of their greatest ship and signed with the blood of their finest crew. From this day forward, humanity would be the storm that other species feared to awaken. The UES Retribution departed Earth orbit, carrying Admiral Hayes toward his new command post in the outer systems. Behind him, the blue world that had given birth to humanity continued its ancient rotation, but the people on its surface were no longer the same species that had first reached for the stars with hope and wonder. They had become something else entirely, something that would ensure the galaxy never forgot the price of betraying humanity's trust. Turner's message had reached its destination. The storm she had warned about was not coming. It had arrived.